Hello, friends. You've tuned into Reflections, a program sponsored by Paducah Cooperative Ministry, where together we do God's work with human hands. I'm Karen Winkel, pastor of United Church of Paducah. I'm co-host, and not with us today in body, but with us in spirit is Gregory Waldrop, who is also co-host. He pastors at Fountain Avenue United Methodist Church. We have an exciting program for you today, talking about women in ministry, and with us today are two Episcopal priests. I like to use that word priest because I don't use that for myself, but Ellen Ekevag and Libby Wade, who pastor together at Grace Episcopal, and welcome both of you. And Ellen, I know you pastor not only at Grace, but
yes,
elsewhere.
Also two other churches in Western Kentucky, Trinity Episcopal Church in Fulton, Kentucky, and St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Hickman.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Well, welcome. So you have what in my tradition would be called kind of a 3-point charge.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. So you're young enough you can handle that. Yeah. And Libby, welcome. You pastor here in town, and
yes.
I've
been here for 2 years at Grace Church, having moved here from Louisville.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just tell our viewers what's exciting to you in your ministries at Grace and in Hickman and Fulton. Yeah. Tell us just a little bit about what's happening now.
The greatest excitement for me at Grace Church right now is the growth in young adult ministry, and that is largely due to our being able to have Ellen on staff since last year. She's really making a huge difference and gathering young adults together.
Marvelous.
And this is my first year of ministry. I started June 1st of last year, so I've been learning all kinds of things: how to do young adult ministry, how to do small church ministry, how to be an assistant, how to be the priest in charge. So
your plate is full. Yeah. And newly ordained.
I was ordained September 9th of last year.
And talk a little bit about we all can do that, but talk a little bit about your journey into ordained ministry.
Well, really, I think I felt the call to ordained ministry when I was about 8 or 9. I grew up at the cathedral, which is in Louisville, and the priest there at the time was a woman. Her name is Jerry Wolf. She's now the Bishop of Rhode Island. And so I never questioned that women could be in ministry. For me, it was always, well, of course women can be in ministry. And at the age of 8 or 9, I really felt sort of the presence of God. And I had older people in the church who would come and say to me, "Ellen, you're going to be a priest when you grow up." And I would say, "You people are nuts. No way." It turns out, though, that sometimes you have to fight your call in a way to prove it to yourself. And I finally came to terms with it when I was in college. And I always kind of knew that that's what I was supposed to do. It wasn't ever really a question for me, although I did question it itself. And so it was very natural. I took a year out from college, I got married, and I went to seminary.
So a gradual process for you, really, of kind of growing into something that people had seen in you and that you'd felt inside.
Yeah, and that the church was always really important to me, and that I really felt like that God was calling me to something, even though I didn't know if I had all the gifts for that. That I really felt God's call. That's where I felt the most passion, the inner welling of the Spirit. So,
and my experience is similar and yet very different, having experienced a call to ministry also as a teenager, but 3 decades before Ellen, in another denomination where there were no role models for women in ordained ministry. So the little country church that I was part of, when I went forward at an altar call one night and said that I thought that God was calling me to ministry, full-time Christian service, affirmed that call in some very, very wonderful ways, but none of us had any way of defining what that was going to mean. And it took me 20 years to get back to understanding a bit more of that. And numerous times, through all that time, I always worked in the church as a layperson, most often on staff as either an organist or Christian formation director, and always feeling like I was following God's call to me, but not quite. As if there were one hand tied behind my back. And it seemed like every 7 or 8 years, something would happen in my life that would push me to really reconsider what I was doing and look for that way to fulfill God's call to me back when I was 16. And eventually that came, and it was a process of God wearing me down, I think, because by the time I had found my way into the Episcopal Church, and the Episcopal Church was ordaining women in 1976, I had a child and lived far from a seminary, and it seemed an impossibility to even pursue what I felt in my heart. Eventually we moved to Louisville, and when I started saying yes but to God again, it was pointed out to me that there were 2 perfectly good seminaries in Louisville, and my children were in high school, and it was hard to keep saying yes but, and so I finally gave in and, in a sense, submitted to the will of God that I knew had been there from many years before, and then within a year was in seminary in Louisville, and then transferred to an Episcopal seminary in New York, and spent a year there without my family, and graduated, and then was ordained in 1998 to the diaconate, and then early 1999 to the priesthood.
Well, both of you have this story of kind of this gradual unfolding of that call, of growing into understanding about what that would mean, and I would put myself in that same group as well, kind of an easing into my experience in the church was that women were very much called into leadership. My first experience of woman clergy person was when I was in high school, and it seemed kind of like, well, isn't that natural? But women in my church were very much given positions of leadership and celebrated for that. But I kind of, like you, Ellen, really felt that young, and you as well, Libby, but didn't quite know what name to give it, and was given opportunities for leadership and learning and service and all that. I say I kind of lost the argument because I really didn't want to be ordained, not because there was any issue with that. I just didn't feel convinced that I had the gifts, and finally I thought, well, okay, I'm not convinced, but certainly God is. And then when I went to seminary, I was ordained the same time that you were, Libby, and I don't know, maybe we can talk a little bit about the seminary experience. More than half of my cohorts at seminary, my classmates, more than half were women, and so clearly in my school was an interdenominational school, so it was clear to me that something was happening. God was doing something in denominations across the board to draw more women into ministry, and my guess is that you saw that as well.
I went to Virginia Theological Seminary, which is in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C., and I think my class was probably 50-50, male and female, and also majority of the people in their 20s and 30s.
I think both the seminaries I attended, the Presbyterian Seminary in Louisville and General in New York, were probably close to half and half, male and female. But the average age in the Episcopal Seminary when I was there was somewhere around 42 or 43, and in the Presbyterian Seminary only slightly younger than that. So that's a new trend.
It is a new trend.
More younger candidates. And I think something that has led to that was that so many of us came into the Episcopal seminaries in the 80s and the 90s as second career people who had perhaps experienced a call to vocation earlier, but not been able to pursue it because our denomination didn't ordain women until 1976 or 77, actually.
What do you feel as women clergy relative to the reality that not all denominations are comfortable with ordaining women? Is that something that you feel compelled to respond to, or are asked to respond to, either directly or indirectly?
There are actually still, I believe, 3 dioceses in the Episcopal Church that don't ordain women. So it's still an issue in our own church that our General Convention wrestles with from time to time. I guess I have not gone out of my way to engage other churches and other denominations. I've always been willing to talk with someone if they wanted to or if they asked to. When I was in Louisville, I was for a time on the staff at our cathedral, and we had a companion relationship with the Roman Catholic Cathedral and did some services together. And during that time, we were doing not Eucharistic services, but Lenten services that were just prayer services on Sunday evening, and rotating the location and preachers. And we invited a nun who was on the staff of the Roman Catholic Cathedral to preach at our cathedral. And I remember her saying, I don't want to do that, even though you will allow me to. I'm not willing to, because that's not something I can do in my own church. I, in turn, was invited to preach at the Roman Catholic Cathedral and chose to do so. And that was a really difficult decision for me. And I found the congregation warm and receptive, and it turned out to be a wonderful experience in the end. My assumption being that the people who would not have believed that that was appropriate didn't come. So we all make choices.
Yeah. You know, I went to seminary with some people who didn't believe women should be ordained into the diaconate or the priesthood. And I knew who these people were. And trying to figure out how to have relationship, how to have Christian community on all sorts of issues that we disagreed with. In my seminary, there was a whole breadth of belief, you know, if you want to use political terms from, you know, the right to the left, you know, how do we be Christian community in the midst of disagreeing about certain issues? And for me, I think a lot of my learning came from that experience, in that you sit down and you have lunch with those people. It's not my job to change anyone's belief, but it is my call as a Christian to have relationship with other Christians. And that's really the only way that I know how to do that, is to simply be present and offer myself and try to have some communion with that person.
And really let God do the greater work, which is to move people's hearts and bring awareness and
even if that's not the case, to still know that we can pray for each other.
Exactly.
And that, you know, regardless of these other issues, which are all sort of exterior in a way, that we're still called to be Christians and to live in that Christian community. So for me, it's simply being present, simply engaging that person and letting God do God's work.
Which you may not see the fruits of that. That might, for some, that might be, 20 years from now that a little light bulb goes on for someone. I do know that in this community where women are less often clergy than in other communities, and I don't know if this is the case for either of you, I do catch some people by surprise. I was at a hospital recently looking for a parishioner who was in an intensive care unit and needed to get in during times when visitors wouldn't ordinarily be let in, and I was asking to be let in. And I don't wear a collar as you do. I don't wear anything that would signal outwardly that I'm clergy. And the woman said, well, this is not time for visitors. And I said, well, I'm this person's pastor. And she looked at me and she says, well, it needs to be his personal pastor. And I said, he's a member of my church. I serve a church in Paducah. And I find that happen from time to time, and I understand that. I don't feel offended or defensive about that, but it is interesting because for me, and I don't know how it is for you, the fact that I'm a woman minister isn't something that I think about very often. It is just kind of part of who I am, kind of like I'm right-handed. You know, it just is part of who I am. But have you had experiences of catching folks by surprise?
I think the collar helps in those situations, but I think, you know, I get looks when I wear my collar. And I don't know what those looks means, if they've just never seen a woman in the collar, or is she, you know, I thought Catholic priests only wore a collar, or I think that kind of draws attention in a way. But no one has ever said anything to me to that effect.
I've had some people in elevators at hospitals, yeah, but it's a curiosity, and it's a curiosity that leads to some conversation, and that's always a good thing, I think. So I've always enjoyed when people are willing to say, "Why are you wearing a collar? Are you a minister? Are you a priest?"
Well, certainly we share the responsibilities that our male counterparts do. I'm wondering if there are differences in the way that women serve that have to do with their experience as women. That's a question that I've been kind of pondering for, probably, since I began preparation for ministry, because it seems to me so, but I'll let you answer that question.
We are in a denomination that is, by its very nature, hierarchical, but I suspect that by and large, women clergy have helped us to have a culture in our denomination that is a bit more collegial and a bit less hierarchical, and perhaps to appreciate the value of lay ministry a bit more.
I often wonder about that myself in terms of how does, as women ministers, how is our authority different from a male minister? And that's something that I think about a lot. I've seen in my experience women priests who have a very sort of male aggressive nature. And in the South, that has been not helpful in a lot of situations. So, I think regardless of whether you're male or you're female, I think you have to be sort of authentic to who you are and how you deal with things, because whether you're male or female, you still may have a more male style of leading versus a female style of leading, or somewhere in between that mix. And so I struggle a little with that piece too, if there is a difference. And I think sometimes the difference is just how people receive you. I think it could be that people think of women in ministry as being more motherly, and then when they're not more motherly, what does that mean for that relationship? What are the expectations that women should be like and that men should be like? And I think that's really kind of where the difference that I see comes from.
For me, what I noticed in my first church was, in that church I was the first woman that they'd had, so they didn't quite know how to orient. They didn't quite know how to understand what that meant in some ways. But one of the differences that I felt was that there seemed to be a lack of appreciation for the way in which a pastor focuses on relationships in the congregation. That was a high priority for me, and I know that comes out of my, my womanhood. That women tend to be more attuned to relationships and the finer points of relationship, and I sense a struggle in the congregation, really wanting achieving goals, and the outcome was more important for them. That was their their reference point was what their male ministers had accomplished in their midst, as opposed to how the minister had helped nurture relationships and heal some broken parts of relationship. So that would be a difference there. I wonder also if with our womanly eyes we read the scriptures differently or understand Jesus differently. Yeah, and I'm sure this was the case in your studies. You know, there were options at my seminary for classes that really did look at scripture from a woman's point of view, with in any number of ways. Do you think women inherently see scripture differently, or talk about that a little bit if you can?
I really enjoyed in seminary in that first year in the scripture classes, having a woman biblical scholar who was a feminist scholar as professor, and discovering all these stories of women in the Hebrew scriptures that I didn't know were there. From the Hebrew midwives and their wonderful part in the Exodus, and Miriam, who I obviously knew the name of, but had never thought of as being so integrally involved in the Exodus experience. And just, it was really an opening experience for me. And my first seminary, the Presbyterian Seminary, was very intent on helping us learn to use more inclusive language. And that was something I'd not truly been exposed to very much until that time. And
using language that isn't exclusively masculine.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience. My Old Testament professor was a woman, and I had a New Testament professor who was also a woman. Actually, I had a male and a female that taught that course. But, I think, as a woman, I pay attention to things perhaps differently. Where that midwife story in the Exodus, I mean, look at what they did for the Israelites, or the women at the well in the Gospels.
Or the stories of Esther and Ruth that don't get a lot of play in our lectionaries.
Yeah, or Abigail and
readings.
David, who, Abigail saves David in a way. And so that, in this sort of, it's so interesting that the Old Testament is sort of a patriarchal culture, and yet all these women sort of rise up as being very kind of strong, and they have a voice, and they have something to say. And that's, I think, carried into the New Testament, where, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's, 4 women in the genealogy. I mean, that's unheard of in the Old Testament genealogies. I mean, that's something completely new. And so for me, that's a very kind of powerful, that feeds me, that gives me hope and encouragement.
When it came time for me to be ordained, and I picked the scripture that I wanted my mentor to preach on, he had been hugely supportive of me all the way through my internship with him. But I really caught him by surprise when I asked for the story of Jesus' encounter with the Canaanite woman. And I think he just kind of paused, and I don't think he ever really understood, and even now, all these years later, maybe he doesn't appreciate enough what it meant to me to have a story lifted up of a woman who kind of wrestles with Jesus and challenges him and helps Jesus learn a little bit more about what his ministry is about. Our time is running short, and I want to be sure to lift up and talk about the Episcopal presiding bishop, and have you talk about that just a little bit, because this is a significant happening in the life of your church and in the life of the wider church. Catherine Jeffords Shorey. Talk about her just a little bit and what this means. It is a milestone, is it not?
It is. She is the first woman to be the head of one of the member churches of the Anglican Communion. we have a number of women who are bishops in the Episcopal Church in the United States, and she was Bishop of Nevada, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a rather small diocese. She has not been ordained a long time, not much longer than you and I, Karen. Was an oceanographer and a pilot before being ordained, still is a pilot for that matter, and just a wonderful, brilliant woman. She was the dark horse, in a sense, in the among the nominees for presiding bishop. The presiding bishop is elected by the bishops of the Episcopal Church, and then the election has to be ratified by the deputies, who are both lay people and clergy, at our General Convention. And I had the privilege of being one of the deputies last summer to the convention that elected Catherine Jefferts Shorey, and we were stunned when the word came from the House of Bishops that they had elected her. And it could not have happened without the male members of that House agreeing to it, with voting for her, because there simply are not enough women bishops at this point to have done it on their own. And that's quite wonderful, that it was not, so to speak, a partisan election. She's already having a huge effect, I think, among her peers around the Anglican Communion as they begin to get to know her and her way of being and her way of showing Christ's face to the world.
It was funny, I was at seminary when the election began, and I remember we were looking at all the candidates, and we're like, oh, well, she's just a token woman. I mean, there's no way she's going to be able to win this. And I was actually driving from Louisville back to Western Kentucky when I got a phone call from a seminary friend of mine who said, have you heard? I said, no, I haven't heard. She goes, they elected the woman. And we were all completely stunned. But I think across the board, I mean, I think that her leadership the things that I've heard, I've never been able to meet her, but that she's just this phenomenal leader, that she has this ability to be very non-anxious, to be very present, to really keep focus on our mission in this world, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, and to care for the poor, and is really trying to live out that kind of servant ministry at a very high level. And for me, it's been very phenomenal to watch from a distance that ministry happen.
Marvelous.
Yeah.
Well, we're all out of time. This just has flown by. We could easily do another program, and perhaps we should, and invite, because I know there are more women involved in ministry in this area than just the three of us. So Ellen Ekevag and Libby Wade, thank you for sharing with us, and thank you for joining us here at Reflections, this program sponsored by Paducah Cooperative Ministry. However you can, wherever you can, do join us in doing God's work with human hands. Shalom.